On a cold December night in 1962, inside a small Chicago nightclub called the Gate of Horn, the air was thick with cigarette smoke and low, careful laughter. The room was dark, the kind of dark that made a single stage light feel like the only honest thing in the world. On that stage stood Lenny Bruce, the most dangerous comedian in America. And somewhere in that crowd, at a small table not far from the back, sat a clean-cut young comedian in a pressed suit and a narrow tie. His name was George Carlin. He was 25 years old, and he had come only to watch. He had come to see the man he admired more than anyone else in the business. He had not come to be arrested. But before the night was over, both men would be sitting in the back of the same police wagon, the doors locked, the streets of Chicago sliding past outside. And the young man in the suit would begin to understand something he could not yet put into words. The safe and polite career he had been building, the one his managers wanted, the one the television people wanted, was not the life he had been meant to live. Nobody in that room understood what was about to happen. The audience was still laughing. The drinks were still cold. But the police were already gathering near the door, and the night was about to take a different shape entirely. Now look at the young man at the back table. In 1962, George Carlin was not yet the sharp-tongued figure in black that the world would come to know. He was clean-cut and neatly dressed, with short hair and a bright, agreeable smile. He worked as part of a comedy team, doing polished routines built for television and nightclubs that wanted nothing controversial. He was funny, he was quick, and he was going somewhere. Managers liked him. Bookers liked him. He was exactly the kind of comedian the industry rewarded. And yet, sitting there in the dark, watching Lenny Bruce, Carlin felt something that would not leave him alone. He was watching a man do the thing he secretly wanted to do and was afraid to try. He was watching someone tell the truth on a stage and pay a real price for it. There was admiration in that feeling, but there was also something heavier, something closer to shame. Because Carlin knew that his own act, the one that was working, the one that was safe, did not carry that kind of honesty. He was a young man caught between two versions of himself, the one who could keep smiling and climbing, and the one who wanted to say what he really thought and let the pieces fall where they may. He did not know it yet, but the night was about to force the question. In a few minutes, he would not be watching a man make a difficult choice. He would be making one of his own. To understand what happened that night, you have to understand who Lenny Bruce was in 1962. He was not simply a comedian who told jokes. He was a man who used the stage the way a preacher used a pulpit, and a poet used a page. He spoke about religion, about politics, about hypocrisy, about the words people were afraid to say out loud. And in an America that was still tightly buttoned, still cautious, still watching its language in public, that made him a threat. Police departments in several cities had begun sending officers into his shows, not to laugh, but to listen. They sat in the back with notebooks, writing down the words he used, waiting for him to cross a line that existed only in their heads. Lenny Bruce had already been arrested more than once for what he said on a stage. Not for stealing, not for hurting anyone, but for speaking. The men in the back rows were not there to judge whether he was funny. They were there to decide whether he was legal. And that distinction, the difference between a comedian and a criminal, could be settled by a single word spoken into a microphone under a hot light. It is difficult all these years later to explain how heavy that pressure was. A performer could lose his livelihood, his freedom, and his good name for a routine that today would barely raise an eyebrow. This was the world George Carlin was stepping into as a young performer. It was a world where comedy could be careful and comfortable and pay the bills, or it could be honest and risk everything. For most comedians of that era, the choice was simple. You kept it clean, you smiled for the cameras, you took the safe road. But that December night, the safe road and the dangerous road were about to cross inside one small club, and a young man in a suit was going to be standing exactly where they met. It happened quickly. The music of the room, the laughter, the low murmur of conversation, all of it stopped as uniformed officers moved onto the stage and brought the performance to an end. Lenny Bruce was taken into custody in front of the very audience that had come to see him. But the police did not stop there. They turned toward the crowd. They decided that everyone in the room would be questioned. One by one, they began moving down the line of stunned patrons, demanding that each person produce identification. You can imagine the fear in that room. These were ordinary people who had come out for a night of comedy, and now they were being treated like suspects. Most of them did exactly what frightened people do. They reached into their pockets, pulled out their cards, and handed them over without a word. Nobody wanted trouble. Nobody wanted to be the one who stood out. The safest thing, the only sensible thing, was to cooperate and go home. And at his small table near the back, George Carlin watched the officers come closer, table by table, card by card. He was a young comedian with a promising career and everything to lose. He had no reason to make himself a target. All he had to do was reach into his jacket, show his identification, and disappear into the night like everyone else. The officer reached his table, and George Carlin looked up. On the stage, Lenny Bruce was doing what he did better than anyone alive. He was not reciting jokes he had memorized. He was thinking out loud, following an idea wherever it led, turning the ordinary language of America inside out until the audience saw it fresh. He would take a word that people used carelessly and hold it up to the light, asking why it frightened them, why it had power, who had decided it was forbidden. To the young comedians watching, this was electrifying. Carlin sat very still through it. He was studying more than the jokes. He was studying the nerve it took to stand there, alone, and refuse to flinch while men with notebooks wrote down every syllable. He was watching a performer treat the audience as adults, capable of hearing hard truths, and he could feel how rare and how fragile that respect was. It was dangerous, and everyone in the room could feel the danger. Because the truth was, the people who wanted to silence Lenny Bruce were not imaginary. They were real, and some of them were sitting in that very club, watching, waiting, taking notes. Bruce knew this. He had been arrested before. He understood that every time he stepped onto a stage and refused to soften himself, he was gambling with his freedom. And he did it anyway, night after night, because he believed the stage was one of the last places in America where a person could still tell the truth. For George Carlin, this was the lesson that would take years to fully land, that comedy could be more than entertainment, that a joke, told honestly, could be an act of courage. But courage has a cost, and the bill for that particular night was about to arrive. Because as Lenny Bruce spoke, The officers near the door had heard what they came to hear. And now they were moving. And so the two of them ended up in the same place. Lenny Bruce, the most dangerous comedian in America, and George Carlin, the young man who was supposed to have a safe and sensible career, sitting together in the back of a police wagon as it rolled through the cold Chicago streets. One of them had spent years building a reputation for saying the unsayable. The other had just thrown away an evening of caution for a principle he could barely explain. There is a story that has followed Carlin for the rest of his life about what passed between them in that wagon. As the tale goes, Lenny Bruce, who had every reason to be angry or afraid, looked over at the young man who had gotten himself arrested for refusing to show his papers and asked him what on earth he thought he was doing. It was not a scolding. It was almost tender, the way an older performer speaks to a younger one who has done something both foolish and brave. Because Bruce understood exactly what had happened. He had watched a young man make the same kind of choice he made every single night, the choice to refuse, to stand apart, to accept the cost of honesty. Two comedians, one wagon, the streetlights sliding past the windows. For George Carlin, still clean-cut, still in his suit and tie, that ride was something close to a beginning. He had crossed a line that night, and there would be no going back to the man he had been before. What George Carlin said next was quiet, but it changed everything. The officer asked him for identification, and Carlin, the promising young comedian in the pressed suit, told him no. He said that he did not believe in identification cards. He said he did not believe in showing papers to prove who he was. It was not a shout. It was not a scene. It was a simple, calm refusal from a man who, in that single moment, decided he would rather stand with the comedian on that stage than blend safely into the crowd. It was, on the surface, a reckless thing to do. He had a career to protect. He had nothing to gain and a great deal to lose. A wiser, more careful man would have handed over the card and gone home. But something in George Carlin refused. Maybe it was everything he had just watched Lenny Bruce do. Maybe it was years of feeling like a fraud in his own safe act. Maybe it was simply the recognition that if he cooperated now, he would be choosing the comfortable road forever. Whatever it was, in the space of a few seconds, a young man made a decision he could not take back. It was the kind of choice that reveals a person to themselves, the kind that answers a question they had been avoiding for years. The officer did not find it amusing. He did not admire the principle behind it. He saw only a man refusing a lawful order. And so, George Carlin was placed under arrest, right there in the nightclub, for the crime of standing beside his hero. The charges against George Carlin that night did not amount to much in the end. He was a young man who had refused to show identification, and the matter faded. But the night itself never faded. It stayed with him, because standing beside Lenny Bruce, sharing that wagon, being arrested for the simple act of refusing to fall in line, gave Carlin a glimpse of the comedian he would eventually become. It would take years. He would keep the clean act for a while longer, keep smiling for the cameras, keep climbing the safe way. But the seed had been planted in that Chicago club, and it kept growing quietly underneath the surface. By the end of the decade, George Carlin would tear his own image apart. He would grow out his hair, put on the denim, drop the polished routines, and begin saying the things he truly thought about America, about language, about the words people were afraid of. he would become one of the most fearless voices comedy has ever produced. And in the years that followed, whenever people asked him where that courage came from, his mind would return to a smoky nightclub and a man he admired more than any other. Lenny Bruce would not live to see how far his young admirer would go. But he had shown him the road that night, and he had ridden the first mile of it beside him. George Carlin thought he had gone to the Gate of Horn simply to watch his hero. Instead, he had found the beginning of himself.